Thank you to the St. Francis History Department and the Center for Women's and Gender Studies for having me here today. If you guys can't hear me in the back, please let me know. We often hear the question asked, what shall we do? Every man and woman may do something by showing that we fear not, by opening our mouths for the silent and pleading the cause of those who are ready to perish. Angelina Grimke-Weld, abolitionist and founding member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, spoke those words before a gathering of male and female, black and white anti-slavery activists as a racist mob tried to burn the building down around them. Weld stood on the stage of Pennsylvania Hall as a representative of the first female integrated abolition society in America and told her audience that together they could lift their voices like a trumpet and overthrow Southern oppression. She was the embodiment of all that the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society believed, that women had the right to work politically and publicly to end slavery, that black and white Americans could work together for a common cause, and that their work would be an inspiration to other activists around the country and might change the face of abolition. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was unusual in several ways. The most important being that it was the first all-female abolition society in America, and it was the first interracial abolition society comprised of men or women. The Philadelphia Society was not the only female abolition society for long, as many other all-female groups sprang up in the early years of the anti-slavery movement. However, it would remain one of the only integrated abolition groups for the entire period of the anti-slavery movement. The Society's female and integrated nature profoundly shaped their approach to black liberation and made them unique in their commitment to community-based and practical activism, as well as to the larger national fight to end slavery. Before we talk about the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, it is important to know a little bit about the background against which they were founded. By the 1830s, American women were beginning to carve out space for themselves as social reformers, focusing mostly on problems that were seen to be connected to the female experience. Things such as helping widows and orphans who lived in poverty, fighting to end prostitution and drunkenness, and supporting Christian evangelical groups that were going into the western frontier and working among Native American tribes. This work was not without controversy. On the one hand, female reformers argued that they had a specific need rooted in their virtue and compassion to do what they could to help the poor, the suffering, and the socially downtrodden. Most benevolent reformers were Protestant Christians who claimed a religious moral authority that gave them the right and the responsibility to work for social improvement. They also argued that women, through their innate sense of justice and compassion, made the best social reformers because they were empathetic and able to act solely on behalf of those less fortunate than themselves. Critics of female benevolent activism claimed that women should not take part in any public debate. They should restrict themselves to the home and to the concerns of their families. Some even said that women did not have the mental capacity to understand issues like poverty, or that exposing themselves to the problems of prostitution and drunkenness would destroy their basic femininity. They agreed that women were compassionate and that they were more virtuous than men. But they felt that the empathetic nature of women made them more fragile and that had to be protected. Ultimately, female reformers prevailed because they were able to claim that the work they did to end the social ills of poverty, prostitution, and drunkenness made the community safer and stronger, which helped their families, their children, and made the world better for women and for other vulnerable people. And this is an argument that would ultimately fail when women became involved in abolition work. So why was anti-slavery activism different than other benevolent activism? It's because it was inherently political. Abolition work challenged the state and the right of political bodies to continue to pursue an economic system predicated on the forced labor and abuse of human beings. When women became anti-slavery activists, they were stepping firmly into the world of politics, which was a world women had been denied access to, and was still considered inappropriate for the softer sex. The white women who formed the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society would make their transgression worse by insisting on working hand in hand with black female abolitionists. Very few activist circles, and none run by women, were integrated in the 1830s. The Philadelphia Society forged a new path for female activism, and their decisions impacted every aspect of their work for the following 3 decades. In 1833, a diverse group of 45 women decided to establish the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Some of these women had worked to end slavery through earlier efforts, either run by the Quaker Church or as a female auxiliary to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, which was an all-male group. But they felt it was time to found an all-female abolition group. The original roster of the Philadelphia Society reads like a who's who of early abolition. Founding members included nationally famous abolitionists, such as Angelina and Sara Grimke and Lucretia Mott. It also included prominent Philadelphians, such as Lydia White, Mary Grew, and members of the city's most powerful black families, the Fortons, the Purvises, and the Douglases. The Society's original constitution reflects its interracial character. While most white abolition groups downplayed the nature of Northern prejudice, the Philadelphia Society emphasized the sin of racism and the need for mitigation against unequal conditions. One of their stated goals was to adopt such measures as may be in our power to dispel the prejudice against the people of color and to improve their condition. The politically engaged and interracial character of the Philadelphia Society challenged many contemporary ideas about acceptable behaviors for genteel women. Abolitionist women were aware that their public and inherently political critiques of slavery were considered unfeminine and inappropriate by many members of their community, even in Philadelphia, which was an extremely progressive city. The members of the society became skilled at both acknowledging the gendered system within which they lived and overstepping those boundaries when necessary. In their 3rd annual report, the Society's officers articulated their understanding of this tension. We will never overstep the boundaries of propriety, but when our brothers and sisters lie crushed and bleeding, we must do with our might what our hands find to do, pausing only to imagine what is right. In their early years, the Society focused on spreading awareness about the conditions of slavery, circulating anti-slavery petitions, and raising money to support abolitionist causes. In order to attract new members and inform the public about the horrors of slavery, the Philadelphia Society regularly sponsored speeches by male and female, black and white abolitionists. They also focused heavily on petitioning Congress to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and to prohibit the interstate slave trade. And they petitioned the state of Pennsylvania to allow jury trials for people accused of being runaway slaves. Historians disagree over whether the abolitionist women saw the act of petitioning as being inherently political. But they do agree that the petition was the most powerful political tool that American women could employ as individuals, but more importantly, collectively, in the 19th century. Petitioning was controversial among female groups for this very reason. As women walking the fine line between socially acceptable local reform and socially untenable public activism, they considered their tactics carefully. The First Amendment guarantees all citizens the right to petition their government. But in the early 19th century, there was considerable debate over whether or not women were citizens. If they were, then they had the right to petition. If they weren't, then they were seizing a political tool that did not belong to them. Some female abolition groups were most comfortable restricting their activism to local efforts to raise money and local awareness campaigns, because they were concerned that if they reached into broader political worlds of petitioning, they would draw too much criticism and that they would not be able to withstand the scrutiny. The Philadelphia Society seems to have been completely comfortable with embracing a political identity and utilizing whatever tools were available to them in the fight against slavery. Speaking at the first Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, Philadelphia Society founder Mary Grew suggested that petitioning should be a widespread activity among all female abolition groups. She argued that petitions could make the biggest difference in abolition work, and said that when all the maids and matrons of the land knock at the door of Congress, our statesmen must legislate. Between 1836 and 1838, the Philadelphia Society gathered nearly 10,000 signatures on dozens of petitions sent to the state and federal government. However, in 1838, they began to focus less on petitioning and more on raising money for abolitionist causes. This shift was partly due to congressional passage of the gag rule in 1836, which made it impossible to read any anti-slavery petition on the floor of Congress. And it was also partly due to an increase in racial violence in Philadelphia, which had risen in part in reaction to female integrated public abolition work. This rise in violence threatened the safety of abolition women who went around the city seeking signatures. There is some evidence that the society decided that this increased racial violence and threat against their members was also dissuading new members from joining. And in an effort to entice younger women to join the Philadelphia Society, they abandoned petitioning and the potential threat to their membership. However, their primary concern seems to have been not wasting their time on an effort that was suddenly no longer going to bring about any change. So rather than circulating petitions that could no longer be read on the floor of Congress, the Society decided to focus on raising money through an annual anti-slavery fair. Anti-slavery fairs were incredibly popular in the North in the 1830s and 40s. They were sponsored by female abolition groups, and they were essentially public bazaars at which people could buy homemade goods, such as decorative household items, clothing, and food, pies and cakes, jams and jellies. At anti-slavery fairs, people could also listen to music or to speakers or other kind of public artistic demonstrations. And all the money raised would go to anti-slavery work. By 1840, the Philadelphia Society had raised over $2,000, which is the equal of roughly $50,000 to $65,000 today. The women of Philadelphia did contribute to national abolition work, but they also began sending an annual contribution to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, which gained them both recognition and power within this male-dominated group. They quickly became the largest single fundraiser in the state of Pennsylvania. And over time, they used the money they raised to influence the state society. They served on multiple boards, and they ultimately forced the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society to allow female membership, after which the women of Philadelphia served in leadership positions and oversaw many statewide efforts of petitioning and fundraising. The biggest difference between the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society and women's abolition groups in other states was that they were interracial. Their integrated nature required them to focus not only on abolishing slavery, but also on improving the lives of free blacks in the North. Many abolitionists believed that ending slavery was the only concern, and that once slavery had ended, a free market environment would integrate black workers and would put an end to economic disparity between black and white America. The women of the Philadelphia Society, however, saw the discrimination free blacks faced in the North, and they believed that abolition work needed two goals: to end slavery, but also to fight against racial injustice in the North. And unlike other female anti-slavery groups, the Philadelphia Society had black membership, who brought them firsthand accounts of life in black America. Accordingly, the Society undertook projects that benefited their local black community. Many of Philadelphia's abolitionists and members of the local black community believed that access to education was crucial for African Americans to undermine white prejudice and advance socially. Within the first year of its existence, the Society committed itself to supporting black education in Philadelphia. They formed a committee to assess local public school and decided to establish a girls' school of their own. The Society paid the rent and the teachers' salaries and provided furniture, books, and other supplies for the school for 15 years. They supported reading groups for black women and other literacy campaigns. They organized public lectures on scientific, historical, and other economic topics that openly encouraged the black community to attend. And they taught sewing skills to women and girls who were looking for work. In the 1840s, the Philadelphia Society expanded its scope beyond education. They chose to support the Vigilant Association, which secretly raised funds to help runaway slaves. And over time, the Society committed itself to providing clothing, food, shelter, other supplies, and fundraising for legal counsel for runaway slaves who had arrived in Philadelphia looking to begin a new life. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was also different from other women's abolition groups because they wholeheartedly supported the somewhat controversial free produce movement. The free produce movement was initiated by British women, but it evolved into an international boycott of goods grown or produced by slaves, and it quickly spread to the United States. It was popular among radical abolitionists who sought to end slavery as quickly as possible. But it was also supported by middling and working class women and free blacks who saw it as an immediate and tangible way to fight against slavery, while also, they hoped, benefiting economically themselves. However, it was this very base of support radical abolitionists, who some saw as the lunatic fringe of the movement, free blacks, and poor women, that made the movement controversial, and in the eyes of some, potentially threatening to a growing capitalist system. In 1824, English Quaker Elizabeth Hayrick wrote a pamphlet called Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, or an inquiry into the shortest, safest, and most effectual means of getting rid of West Indian slavery. She called for the boycott of slave-made goods imported from the British West Indies, primarily focusing on sugar. The pamphlet was reprinted the same year in Philadelphia. Hayrick argued that the contemporary efforts to end slavery were too moderate to produce speedy results, and she suggested that governments were only half-hearted in their efforts to influence the end of the slave state, because it was economically successful in England and also in America. She looked to earlier boycotts, such as the pre-revolutionary boycotts in America, for examples of how average people had been able to use consumerism to influence political systems. An adherent of political theorist Adam Smith, she proposed that slavery would not end until it became economically untenable, that people mostly acted out of self-interest, and that they would continue to support slavery as long as they made money off of slavery. But once slavery became economically unsuccessful, slave owners would voluntarily shift to another economic system. They would choose to end slavery because they couldn't make money off of it, and they would look for a different system of labor. She also argued that the free produce movement could help with another social problem, which was poverty among widows and uneducated people, because they could be trained to replace the goods that were no longer being bought from slave production societies, thereby making money through the production of clothing, candles, and food items that would replace those goods not being imported from the South. Hayrick intended her boycott to focus on the Caribbean, but American abolitionists saw it as a way to strike a blow against the entire system of chattel slavery. Her ideas resonated with abolitionists in the United States, but they were especially well received in Philadelphia, where women across class, racial, and religious affiliations embraced the movement, following the dictates of free produce both in their homes and in the public market. Maintaining a free produce household placed enormous strain on a family, and was, therefore, a very strong statement of a woman's commitment to the abolition cause. While ideologically free produce was very simple, there were significant difficulties associated with a free produce lifestyle. First was the problem of verifying that goods labeled as free actually were. Most goods coming out of the South or the Caribbean passed through at least 2 stages of labor: harvesting the raw materials and producing manufactured final products. Ensuring that only free workers had actually participated in all stages of labor was incredibly difficult. Second, goods made solely with free labor tended to be poorer in quality than those to which consumers were accustomed. Free cotton was coarse and uncomfortable to wear, and many people complained that free sugar candy and other goods made with sugar were absolutely disgusting. Women who could not afford to buy free cloth oftentimes chose to abstain from buying new clothing at all, leading them to be shabby and have an appearance that could be embarrassing in public. Elizabeth Margaret Chandler, who was a prominent abolitionist writer, tried to convince women that clothing was actually a sign of moral commitment. She wrote, "The texture of your garments will perhaps be coarser than that of your accustomed wear, but they will cling less heavily around your form, for the sighs of the broken-hearted will not linger among their folds." Historian Carol Faulkner has dubbed Philadelphia the capital of free produce agitation. And during the 1820s and 30s, free produce societies and stores flourished in white and black sectors of the city. Elizabeth Margaret Chandler, who was a founding member of the Female Association for Promoting the Manufacture and Use of Free Cotton, which was a group that funded production of cloth by free labor, suggested that it was the moral duty of white northern women who were too sensitively refined to bear a description of the horrors of slavery. It was their duty to support the free produce movement. She argued that by providing an economy for slave-made products, Northerners, though not perhaps in equal degree, must be sharers of the guilt of slavery, and that the only way to lessen that guilt was to actively work on behalf of the boycott. In 1830, Lydia White, who would 3 years later be a founding member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, opened the city's first free produce store, which she would run for 16 years. Her business was so successful that she advertised nationally and shipped orders to states as far away as Vermont, Indiana, and Ohio. By the 1850s, Philadelphia hosted multiple free produce stores selling food, clothing, and household goods. The longevity of White's store and the number of free produce options in the city indicate Philadelphians' commitment to the effort over the course of several decades. Yet, in addition to the difficulties of acquiring goods that could be authenticated as untainted by slave labor, free stores had trouble selling their wares at competitive prices. Free goods were generally produced in smaller quantities, and the laborers had to be paid a reasonable wage, which drove up the price of producing free wares. The goods that sold them then had to pass that price on to the consumer, making the free goods they sold more expensive than slave-made goods. Most free produce stores struggled to remain open, and many cities gave up the idea of having free produce stores very quickly. The fact that Philadelphia had multiple long-lasting stores is a testament to the passionate commitment of local women and their households to the movement. The Philadelphia Society, from its beginning, had been dedicated to supporting the free produce movement. In 1834, they added a 10th amendment to their constitution, which recommended that the members of the society should, at all times and on all occasions, give the preference to free produce over that of slaves, believing that the refusal to purchase and use the products of slave labor is one of the most efficient means of abolishing slavery. The following year, before the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, they demonstrated their commitment to free produce when a member of the Philadelphia Society declared, "It is the duty of all those who call themselves abolitionists to make the most vigorous efforts to produce for the use of their families the products of free labor, so that their hands may be clean in this particular when inquisition is made for blood." By the early 1840s, free produce began to lose its popularity. It was seen as too radical and as empowering for the wrong groups. Moderate abolitionists worried that rather than raising money to fight slavery, all it did was empower economically and politically women to step out of their home and take a prominent place in the public sphere. Some abolitionists also worried that it encouraged too much cooperation between white and black activists. While free produce lost momentum nationally, and to some people became kind of a joke, the members of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society remained committed to supporting free labor and boycotting slave-made goods. Comprised of women who valued individual action and were committed to interracial protest, the society continued its free produce activism even at the risk of alienating potential new membership and losing standing in the national abolition movement. Over the years, various members articulated their reason for supporting this strategy. Mary Grew explained that the boycott was important as evidence of our sincerity, and insisted that abolitionist women must not fall prey to the hypocrisy of purchasing the products of slaves' unrequited labor, thus hiring the oppressor to continue in the commission of sin from which they are, at the same time, solemnly warning them to desist. Frances Ellen Harper echoed this sentiment when she wrote, "Oh, how can we pamper our appetites among luxuries drawn from reluctant fingers? Could slavery exist long if it did not sit upon a commercial throne?" The women of the Philadelphia Society hoped to be an inspiration to other female activists, and they were. Leaders from other societies and women hoping to start new groups wrote to the Philadelphia Society asking for advice. Because they were inordinately successful at raising money and pushing their own agenda, other groups saw the women of Philadelphia as a font of knowledge for smaller and younger societies. Mary Grew, who served for years as the corresponding secretary of the Philadelphia Society, saw it as part of her duty to share her own knowledge with as many other societies as possible, and corresponded with dozens of abolitionist women around the North. In the late 1830s, the Philadelphia Society began publishing its annual reports in pamphlet form. These documents circulated among other women's anti-slavery groups, giving them insight into how one of the earliest and most prominent organizations functioned. Women who were launching abolitionist societies could and did model themselves on men's groups, but they were often more interested in emulating women's activism and modeling themselves on societies that had been founded by women. They were also interested in forming and participating in a network of activist women who could provide information and support in a world that continued to be hostile to female activists, overstepping the bounds of socially acceptable critique into the more obvious world of political reform. A correspondent from the Boston Female Society once commented to Mary Grew that it was necessary to forget all of those little forms of etiquette which under other circumstances we might adhere to in the fight to end slavery. If they stopped and spent time behaving like proper ladies, how would they ever accomplish anything? The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society would continue its work of fundraising for national abolition causes until the outbreak of the Civil War. At that point, they shifted their focus largely to fundraising to support the Union Army and to supporting local initiatives to improve the lives of the city's free black community, agitating specifically for expanded voting rights for black Americans. They disbanded in 1870, considering the passage of the 15th Amendment to have ended any need for them to exist. Some members of the society would move on to become part of the emerging women's suffrage movement, and others would retire from political activism. During their 37 years of existence, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society changed the landscape of women's activism and interracial collaboration. Not all female anti-slavery activists went on to become part of the women's movement, But the Philadelphia Society provided inspiration for many of those who did. Years later, writing to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott would reflect that the 1837 Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, which had been co-hosted by the Philadelphia Society, was the true beginning of the women's movement. It was the first time that women's political activism was taken seriously on a national stage and seen as being distinct from the activism of men. Mott wrote, "From the time of the first convention of women in New York, 1837, our battle began." While women from abolition societies around the North would become members of the women's suffrage movement, the Philadelphia Society's openly political stance and insistence on interracial activism was an inspiration to some suffrage workers who did not want to retreat into socially acceptable spaces or exclude Black women from the fight for the right to vote. Some abolition women chose to drop out of activism after the passage of the 15th Amendment because they felt that working to end slavery had been a moral imperative, but that women should not attempt to be the social and political equals of men. However, the women of Philadelphia and other abolition groups provided an essential inspiration to the activists that would come after them. They had made their place on a public stage in pursuit of national change. They had questioned whether it was really true that only men were citizens and only men should enjoy the privileges of full enfranchisement. They had proven that women had the mental, emotional, and moral capacity to embrace any political, social, or economic role they desired. Later activists working for female suffrage, improved labor laws, enhanced legal rights for married women, and working in the anti-lynching and other Black equality movements would look back to the women of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society and their abolitionist sisters as inspirations, as leaders, and as foremothers in the world of female activism. Thank you. They believed that if you kept constant pressure on Congress, and that if that pressure was visible, Congress would feel that they had to respond, so that women might not be able to vote for who was in Congress, but they could still pressure those people to have to pay attention to the anti-slavery movement and to hopefully respond to what was seen as a strong moral argument against the continuation of slavery. Philadelphia at this time still had an incredibly large Quaker community, and many of the women who became abolitionists were also involved in other Quaker activism. Many of them were leaders in the Quaker Church. Philadelphia is somewhat unusual and different from Boston and New York in that the women who participated in their anti-slavery movement were Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Quaker, whereas abolition in other cities tended to be more Protestant. So they were active across a range of religious backgrounds, and certainly Quaker women were active in kind of other religious efforts. But a lot of these women don't seem to have been kind of pushing religious boundaries in other ways. There were men in Congress in this period who were strongly against slavery, although they were a minority. The gag rule was passed in part because one thing that abolitionist congressmen would do was try and spend the whole day reading these petitions. So they would gather petitions together, and then they would essentially filibuster Congress by reading petition after petition. So it both raised awareness of the need to end slavery and also kept Congress from doing anything else. So the gag rule was passed partly because it had become a tactic among a small minority of congressmen who supported abolition. I mean, the number of anti-slavery congressmen from the North grows the closer you get to the Civil War. But even among Northern congressmen, it's still a minority until very close to the Civil War, because there's this troubling relationship between economic strength based on a slave system and then a kind of moral outrage against slavery. So there were anti-slavery congressmen, but it was up until very close to the Civil War, always a pretty small minority. At its peak in the mid-1840s, there are about 350 women. The commitment to free produce, which was seen by some people as embarrassing, did kind of winnow some women away. And because Philadelphia had a more radical perspective, they had trouble attracting membership as widely as some of the other groups. The Boston group is the biggest female anti-slavery society in the country, and they have close to 1,000 people at the height of their membership. So the Philadelphia group's never as big, but they are incredibly active, and they could raise money like nobody else. So they're smaller, but also extremely effective. For a long time, there was a sort of understanding of the connection between abolition and women's suffrage, that female abolition activists wholesale moved into women's suffrage. And that's not true. There were some women who had become politically active and aware and committed during the anti-slavery movement who just rolled that over into the fight for the right to vote. But there were women who, on the one hand, objected to slavery and saw that as a moral issue, while also believing that women were fundamentally different than men and did not deserve political equality. And those women tended to drop out of political activism after the Civil War. So a fairly healthy percentage of anti-slavery women did continue to be politically active and did support women's suffrage. But there was a more conservative minority who said, this was a fight worth fighting, but women are still different. It's not okay for us to demand full equality. On the whole, they were. On the whole, Philadelphians, again, largely because of this large Quaker population who were very socially progressive, and Philadelphia was on the whole a more liberal city. On the whole, they did support women being involved in abolition. But there was still a discomfort with women crossing certain lines in gender roles. So they were fine with women being abolitionists if that meant fundraising, if it meant supporting speakers or publishing literature, which was all considered to be perfectly acceptable for women. When women stepped outside of their gender roles, when they did things like supporting petitions, which some people felt was a right of citizenship, and if women aren't citizens, they don't have the right. Or sometimes when, especially the white women in the Philadelphia society, would give a public speech alongside a black speaker, stepping into those kinds of integrated environments was considered inappropriate for women, even in a more progressive city. So Philadelphia was overwhelmingly supportive of female abolitionists if they didn't push the boundary of what was acceptable for women. It was when they both stepped into this more political role and did it in ways that were questionable for women that people began to object. On the whole, abolitionist women did experience quite a lot of pressure. There is this sort of language of self-defense, and the fact that either out of a moral imperative that was rooted in kind of a Christian ethic, or sometimes out of a larger moral imperative rooted in the fact that women were believed to be more moral. Women were constantly defending their right to be activists. In Philadelphia, again, because of the Quaker community, it's a little bit different. Quakers had been overwhelmingly against slavery since around the time of the American Revolution. And being an anti-slavery family was very common in Philadelphia. So some women in the Philadelphia society were part of families that were very active in anti-slavery efforts anyway. So being a female abolitionist was not considered to be really transgressive. But that's not the truth for all women in Philadelphia. Some of the women in the Philadelphia society are defending themselves just like everybody else. So sometimes you see these families, like Angelina Grimke Weld. Theodore Weld is a leading abolitionist in America by the 1830s. So they're kind of the country's most famous anti-slavery couple, and he's very supportive of her work. Other women like Diana and Sara Douglas, who are a mother and daughter, who were part of the Female Society in Philadelphia, their husband and father were very uncomfortable with them taking this very public role, and they did it anyway. So a lot of these women did constantly defend themselves and their kind of moral right, but it didn't seem to stop them. Once they'd taken the step and become anti-slavery activists, they tended to just carry on, even with an awareness that their families and sometimes their communities were not in favor of what they were doing. The Philadelphia Society absolutely had broader support than women who actually joined. I mean, part of the way they were able to gather nearly 10,000 signatures from women in really eastern Pennsylvania, not just the Philadelphia area, is that many women who weren't willing to actually attend a meeting or put their name on a charter were willing to sign these petitions. They were willing to attend the anti-slavery fairs, to spend money, to do other things in support of the movement. And over the course of the abolition movement, liberal denominations, the Unitarians, the Episcopal Church, become more aware of the really pressing need to fight against slavery, and they become more and more active. Although that doesn't seem to have translated in Philadelphia into actually joining the society. We think because they were by far the most radical women's group in the country. Again, if you look at Boston, which at its height has nearly 1,000 members, women were joining that group in much larger numbers. That group was also more conservative in its activities. So it's clear there's a much broader base of support, but it doesn't always mean people will actually join the society. They just support the movement in other ways, mostly spending money and then signing petitions. Some people, like myself, and the first Congress of the state of New Jersey, say that women are citizens from the time of the American Revolution. That by being here in the country, women are always citizens. Women from before the Revolution pay taxes. They are sometimes, depending on where you live, allowed to vote in local government and to have a say in public school. So some of us say that women were always citizens and were denied their rights. Other scholars say women become citizens in 1920 when the 19th Amendment passes, and that when women are granted the right to vote, their full citizenship is recognized. But this is a huge debate that's happening in the 19th century. People are trying to figure out, is citizenship gendered? Can women be citizens? Lots of women's suffrage activists certainly say we pay taxes, which makes us a citizen. Other people say that women are essentially a protected group. Women get the benefits of being American, but they're not full citizens. So this is a hugely debated topic. In New Jersey, women are fully enfranchised under the first state constitution, and women vote until the 18 teens, when the state writes a new constitution that disallows women from voting. They literally change the language of their constitution to say only men are citizens of the state. So they change their mind. So really there's no firm answer. And it's certainly something that women at the time debated very hotly. And it's one of the huge arguments behind women's suffrage, is that women are being denied a right that is rooted in their citizenship, and that they cannot fully enjoy the benefits of being citizens until they are allowed to vote. Whereas there are some people who say they don't become citizens until they're allowed to vote. So it's a little bit of a circular historical argument. It's one of the biggest issues in women's history before women's suffrage. If you look at the first half of the 19th century, female writers are all over the map trying to figure out what is their relationship to the state. Are they citizens? Are they a protected group? Do they have, some people say they get the privileges of citizenship without the responsibilities. Yes, they are. Which is why I say they were always citizens. They were just denied access to their civil rights. Around the country, women who supported the anti-slavery movement were sometimes ostracized. The kind of upper levels of society saw this as just being so inappropriate. that women who were very public on behalf of abolition would suddenly no longer be accepted in certain social circles. There was a concern that doesn't ever seem to have really happened, but it certainly is one way men try to deter women from becoming abolitionists. There's this idea that if someone's wife is an abolitionist, they might lose business opportunities, or their reputation will suffer. And we see some men telling their wives and their daughters, don't become activists, you're going to ruin the family. And it doesn't ever seem to have actually happened. But there is a kind of an idea that reputations will suffer, and that if you choose to do this very public form of activism, you could be ruining your future, ruining your family's future. Although largely, the women who choose to become abolitionists don't seem to care. And to whatever degree there is a kind of social backlash, they are fine with that, because it's kind of built into how women understand being activists. There's a little bit of punishment we see against women in the South who become abolitionists, which a few were. Angelina and Sara Grimke are Southerners. Their families owned slaves. And in their early 20s, they chose to leave the South and become anti-slavery activists. And one of the reasons they were very popular speakers is because they talked about growing up in a community where slavery still existed. And they talked about why they chose to become abolitionists. So they were very powerful speakers. But they lost everything. They lost their money, they lost their family connections, they were essentially disinherited from their families. So for them, there was a very high cost. But they're also unusual in the bigger picture of female abolition. When England chooses to abolish slavery, about 30 years before America does, that has no real tangible impact on what happens in America. England continues to be a trade partner with America. So just because England no longer has slavery, that does not stop them from doing business with America. And interestingly, when you get to the Civil War, England supports the Confederacy because they're invested in cotton, and they need the cotton coming from the South. So even though England no longer has slavery, they back the Confederacy. So there's always this complicated relationship between commerce and abolition opinions. So it doesn't really have a tangible impact, but what it does is gives fire to the abolition movement, which is very young in America, but many abolitionists point to England, which of course is the kind of cultural parent of America, and says they gave it up, and if they got rid of slavery, we can get rid of slavery too. That it becomes a model for abolitionists. And many abolitionists try to make an argument that the English economy doesn't collapse, English society carries on, so we in America will be just fine if we get rid of slavery. But we continue to do business with England. England and France both get rid of slavery long before America, and it does not change political relationships, it does not change economic and business relationships. It really just kind of becomes a model and a touchstone for the abolitionist movement to say, these Western European countries that we admire got rid of slavery, so should we. The actual, more tangible relationships don't change at all, even though Europe has given up slavery decades before we do. Because there was an idea as the mid-19th century Western frontier, is the modern day Midwest. And there was an idea that because it was unsettled by Americans, it could be settled as a more racially equal society. So many pro-white activists and free black activists moved to the Midwest to try and create these new societies that would be more racially equal and more racially harmonious. So I don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're not related in some way, since the entire Chandler family picks up and moves as a unit. You're welcome. Anybody else?